and years. Herb Block is for the last 4 years, has been the executive director of the American Zionist movement. He has had a long career in Jewish communal life and public service. I met him when he was assistant executive vice president of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. For 15 years, he was responsible for the government affairs and property restitution portfolios. He was a member of the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad, appointed 3 times by President Obama. He had a career in New York City government. He worked for Mayor Dinkins, a special assistant to the mayor. And then before that, when Mayor Dinkins was the borough president, he sits on a lot of boards. He is really an insider in the Jewish world. It is my great pleasure to stop fighting with Rabbi Avi and bring on our good friend, Herbert Block. How are you, Herb?
How are you, Jonathan? And hello, Avi. Nice to see you both.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
Would be better to be together in person, and hopefully we will all again soon. But this is a good way of communicating and talking. Thank you for inviting me to be with your audience today.
It's our pleasure, and it was good timing because Rabbi Avi and I, after 24 hours of getting along very well, have reverted back to form, and we're starting to get into it. So it's good. It's good. Blessed is the peacemaker. So thank you, Herb. Herb, I wanted to start I want to talk a little bit about your career in the Jewish world, and definitely a lot about what you're doing now with the AZM, with the American Zionist movement. But before that, your father is a rabbi, and also Avi, who's 26 generations or something rabbi. How much pressure on you was there as a kid to become a rabbi? Did you think about becoming a rabbi? What was that process like?
So I grew up as what they call a PK, a preacher's kid. Is a well-known term in America. My father, I'll mention his name, Harav Israel Ben Pesach, Rabbi Irving J. Block, was rabbi, was the founder and spiritual leader for 40 years, from 1954 to 1994, of the Brotherhood Synagogue, a congregation in Manhattan that he started. It was one time part of the conservative movement, but for most of its history and today it's an independent congregation. And he founded it with the name Brotherhood, and the Hebrew name of the synagogue, Kehillah Kadosha Beit Achim, to bring together across denominations Jews of different backgrounds and not have sort of a label on the synagogue, as well as an open pulpit, open door policy, no cost for tickets on the holidays. Members got priority seating, but there were 1,000 people would come on the Chagim for open services that were held separately, which even to this day I hear of people who wouldn't have gone to a synagogue where they were charged tickets and came to his synagogue. And he pioneered in the field of ecumenical work with many Christian communities and faith leaders, and pioneering in outreach to the Black Jewish community, both in America and even in the 50s and 60s with the Jewish community in Ethiopia. So just a little bit about my father, and thank you for mentioning him. So I'm proud to be a rabbi's son. I was always interested in sort of public service and community service, which is part of what a rabbi does. And I, went to day school my whole life, but never decided to become a rabbi, but decided to engage in public and communal service in a different way, both in the first part of my career in New York City and Washington in government and politics, and for the last 20 some odd years working in the Jewish community. So I consider myself to keep up my father's tradition of public and community service, and do it in a different way.
And just about your father's really a legendary figure, and certainly I remember when I've been to Brotherhood Synagogue many times, and always heard them speaking about your father in this legendary way. But it's also a very beautiful, interesting synagogue. First of all, because it's in Gramercy Park, which is its own sort of secret world that's hidden really to many New Yorkers, because you need the key for the park and all that. It's overlooking the park. And also because it was a Quaker meeting house, which is, I think the building itself is 150 years old, or so, the middle of the 19th century. Beautiful. As a synagogue, it's very unusual. It's certainly not your typical synagogue building.
So I'll let me tie a couple of things together. One, my father started the Brotherhood Synagogue in '54, and they shared a building with a church. And they had this agreement of when things were covered in the sanctuary and the services on different days, and had a fantastic relationship with a Presbyterian minister, Dr. Stitt. They traveled the world together. They visited Germany in the '60s. They did a lot of ecumenical work together. He retired, and then in the early '70s, a new pastor came in, who the Presbyterian Church, I guess, sent in, but besides being a church wrecker, having done that in previous congregations, he was an anti-Semite. And during the Yom Kippur War, he put up a bulletin board in support of the Arabs for victory over Israel. And at that moment, things had already been declining. My father said the synagogue is moving out, and they marched out with no home to go. They were basically a homeless congregation for a year. They davened with Orthodox shuls, conservative reform, all over the place, until they found this building that was a Quaker meeting house that had been vacated, which was perfect for a shul because it had no, the Quaker meeting houses have no sort of denominational objects on the wall. Didn't need a lot of repair for it to begin to be used as a synagogue building. It had been a stop on the Underground Railroad, harboring freed slaves. So it was a historic building that sort of fit in perfectly with what my father was doing, and it began a new life for the synagogue, which has grown and flourished in Gramercy Park, on the park, an area that, in the early 100 years ago, Jews weren't so welcome there, in Gramercy Park. So it was, quite a change, both in the neighborhood, and things have evolved. But it's a historic building that's taken on a new life now for the last since the 1975 as a flourishing synagogue downtown.
Yeah, and a beautiful, really just a wonderful, wonderful space, very welcoming. I just, my experience, I once went there when we were opening our preschool to meet with the preschool director there, and I'm speaking to her, and she goes, "Oh, you're Poland? Oh, actually, I know Poland pretty well. My brother used to work in Poland." And I go, "Oh, your brother, what did he do?" And she goes, "Oh, my brother was the U.S. ambassador to Poland. There was Lee Feinstein's sister is running the preschool."
That's how I bonded with Lee Feinstein the first time I met him. The U.S. ambassador to Poland under President Obama, his sister ran the nursery school. So the first time I met him, he said, "I know all about your connection." So it's a small Jewish world.
So I think you've had all these difficult, sort of Israel and Zionism and New York City politics, and then sort of international, the middle, which is what I want to talk about now, is sort of your career in terms of your work at JDC, which is of course an institution, one of the founders of our center here, really the overseas, in many ways, the overseas arm of American Jewish philanthropy around the world. It's 105-year-old, 110 almost year old organization. Can you maybe talk a little bit about your work there, dealing and especially how it relates to Poland? Do you remember your first visit to Poland? How did you, because I would call you an expert these days on Poland. How did that happen?
So I stopped counting at some point, but my first of about 50 trips to Poland was in August or September of 1999, when I was working at JDC, and we were helping to arrange the Jewish community property restitution with the Jewish community of Warsaw, the Jewish community headquartered in Warsaw, the Union of Jewish Communities of Poland, and the World Jewish Restitution Organization. So JDC was very involved, and still is. I left there in 2015, then came to AZM, but JDC was very involved from the fall of the Iron Curtain with the whole issue of compensation for Holocaust survivors and Jewish property restitution, reclamation of property that had been looted from Jewish individuals, and especially from Jewish communities during the period of the Shoah and during the communist period. And there was a lot of work to be done in Poland for obvious reasons that I'm sure your viewers and listeners know. There was a debate going on throughout Eastern Europe in all the different countries about how to arrange the property and the assets to help benefit the local Jewish community, to maintain the cemeteries that remained, to preserve buildings that have historic value, but also support the living Jewish community that's there, the people, and how to balance and not just in Poland, but all the countries of Eastern Europe, the Jewish community that is there now or was there, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the Jewish diaspora, the survivors, the descendants of people from those countries who also felt a connection and a claim to benefit from whatever is restituted, because their families, even if you live in Israel, Europe, Australia, South Africa, Canada, America, their families, descendants of that country helped build those buildings, are buried in the cemeteries, and there was a sort of a tension and how to strike the right balance. So what happened in most countries, there was a partnership, it still exists in Poland today, between the local Jewish community and something called the World Jewish Restitution Organization, WJRO, ELAR in Hebrew, the Irgun Olami LaHashavat V'chush, that is an Israeli amuta that is an umbrella of about a dozen international Jewish organizations that works on representing world Jewry in property in Eastern Europe, much as the way the Claims Conference does with properties in Germany and Austria. And so JDC, having worked with the Jewish communities in those countries, played a role in helping facilitate that arrangement in different countries. And Poland, obviously, with the largest community, the most properties, the most towns, the biggest destruction, was a center player in that area. And so we started to work to set up what became FUDS, I want to try to pronounce it in Polish, the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage, which has reclaimed many properties, cemeteries, and done a lot of work on preservation of Jewish property. When we find there was a
communal property, let me just jump in.
Jewish communal property, right?
So I think it's important because people get very confused with that.
There were about 5,000 claims identified. The government had set up a period from 1997 to 2002 in which claims had to be submitted. Due to various reasons, the whole claims process got finished in the last year or two. Things always happen at the last moment, and by the deadline in 2002, over 5,000 claims had been submitted. Here we are almost 20 years later, and about half of them still remain unprocessed, which is just a shockingly slow system of bureaucracy.
And the process and things are frozen. I know that nothing new is really going through the system.
The process moves at a turtle's, or shouldn't say a snail, it's not kosher, pace, but it's been very slow, drawn out process with a lot of bureaucracy. There is no progress in Jewish private property restitution,
right, which is what I wanted to ask you about.
Property of individuals. But that's how I first came to Poland to work with the Jewish community and made dozens of trips. Was coming at a point every couple of weeks. And the U.S. State Department, the U.S. government was very involved in helping to facilitate the arrangements with through the U.S. Embassy and officials from Washington that would come in to facilitate this arrangement so we could get the Jewish property claims moving. And through that, I also got involved and interested in the issue of Jewish cemeteries, not just in Poland, but throughout all of Eastern Europe. And one thing and another led to me being on the U.S. Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad and some other bodies that deal with preservation of Jewish cemeteries. I still sit today on the board of the FUDS, the Foundation for Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland. So because of COVID, I've missed a year or so of being in Poland. I always tell everyone I've been to Poland over 50 times, but never been to the Grand Canyon. So
there you go. Well, Poland is like Poland in some ways is the Jewish Grand Canyon, isn't it? A big void for seen in the Jewish world in that sense. Not obviously not the way that we see it, but we do understand the larger, the way it's viewed. Herbert, I wanted to ask you a little bit. You touched on something which is interesting, a very complicated subject, and not that I expect you to solve it, although if anyone can, Herb, about Jewish private property. So they're really the property, the Nazis took communal property, so synagogues, and then things were nationalized, of course, depending on the country. So synagogues, schools, Maccabi, sports clubs, hospitals, orphanages, all of these Batei Midrash, study halls, all of these things,
mikvahs, rabbi houses, right?
all
Everything.
of these, right? So this is called community property. But private property, your grandfather, father, uncle, whoever family owned a mill or an apartment building or a house in the village or in the middle of Krakow or something. And this is something that every other country in Europe, to some degree, has put this to rest. So there is some kind of mechanism in every other country except Poland for dealing with private property. It doesn't mean that you can't get it back. It just means there's no specific mechanism for Jews, right? If my grandfather had a property, I just have to go into the normal Polish court system, which is an incredibly high burden of proof. So why is that the case, that Poland, in your opinion, that Poland hasn't passed a private property law?
I mean, both of you are probably better experts on the Polish culture than me, but Poland, I mean, part of it is the sheer volume of property and the destruction of what happened. And it's not just, the issue of private property in Poland often gets played out in the media as a Jewish issue, but it's really not. I forget the numbers offhand, but the vast majority of property that was nationalized by the government was private property of non-Jews, of local Polish Catholics and other local Polish residents. Obviously, the issues are compounded for the Jewish victims who came back, who had their property really confiscated first during the Holocaust. Not to mention a whole other subject, which some countries have dealt with, which is heirless property of the Kedoshim, the almost 3 million Jews of Poland who left no heirs, and that property then went to the state, and there's not even any discussion about compensation for that. So Poland, I think, because of you can talk better, the political situation, the volume of property, the impact it would have, has been very slow. There have been proposals up and down, but nothing has gone forward in any meaningful way. There are individuals who do manage to go to court and find some defect. When the county, the voivoda, confiscated the property in 47, the clerk forgot to stamp page 11, and then you can go to court 50 years later and say, oh, the taking or the confiscation was invalid because they didn't stamp it properly, they didn't file it in the right courthouse, or things like that, and try to get some compensation for the property. Most people don't want to come and return to their property. They just want an acknowledgement that these are assets that were looted, that belong to their family, were taken first by the Nazis and then nationalized by the government. So because of the size and the destruction of what happened in Poland, it's become a more complicated issue, and legacy of the period of martial law. So there have been some efforts in other countries, limited, never really full, but the struggle remains in Poland, though Poland did make some small and very slow progress on the issue of community property restitution.
Yeah, I feel like there was progress being made with previous government about the individual issue, about individual property, and these days it's such a political, it's a very, very complicated political topic here, this idea. And we, Rabbi Avi and I and Rabbi Shudrik and all of us who are here building Jewish life in Poland, it's complicated, because on one hand we want justice for people who's lost their property and from their families, but on the other side it's like, these days it's our focus is on the living Jews of Poland, not so much on so from the justice point of view, of course, but sometimes there's justice, and then there's sort of what's helpful to the local community.
And with all the efforts, sorry, Avi.
No, you go ahead. I just had a question for you.
I was going to say, with all the efforts also on preserving cemeteries and property and buildings, there's also balance. What are the historic buildings to be preserved? We're the Am Sefer, we're not the Am Binyan, we're the people of the book, and Jewish buildings have a historical value, and there's halachic issues of what happens to a building and what it gets used for later. Obviously many community properties don't have any, you know, status that, you know, of halacha. But you know, especially issues of Jewish cemeteries, I learned on, you know, from the legendary Rabbi Chaskel Besser, before my first visit to Poland, you know, there's no such a thing as a former Jewish cemetery. Any land that was a Jewish cemetery is in perpetuity a Jewish cemetery. It's a different concept that people have for different religions. They have a different understanding of what can be done with a burial ground later on. And you know, there's a lot of people with connections to their family or ancestral cemetery. But I remember hearing from Rabbi Bleich in Ukraine. He said, you know, I can always find a donor who wants to give for the Beis HaChaim, and the Beis HaChaim is a word for the you know, the another term for a cemetery. But for the Chaim, the living in my schools and in my programs, it's a lot harder. So you know, it's as you know, it's a challenge to raise money and keep things going for the living Jews, which is something the JCC is a model and done an amazing job. And you know, has to be balanced with also obviously preserving our heritage and sites, and in many towns, the cemetery or the building that's there, and I visited many of these small towns or former shtetls, you know, no one even knows there was 700 years of Jewish life in that town, right, except for, you know, one old building or the cemetery, and that's the only thing to connect people to know their history. And you know, the FUDs and others have done projects, you know, to bring memory back and not just talk about the physical property, but educate people about, right, you know, what was here before,
of course,
the Holocaust.
The great challenge for us in Poland is to
right,
balance the past versus the present, right, and the future.
I was going to ask you that, you know, I've been traveling for 7-8 years, and Jonathan for been here, living here, but we're inevitably, when we meet Jews in North America, Australia, Israel, wherever we are, you know, and we tell about what we're doing, and you have been 50 times in Poland, so you get the question as well. You're always going to run into one or a group of people who say, Poland, I would not go spend a dime there. I wouldn't, how dare, you know, and it could go all the way to an extreme. And it's a really hard thing, especially if that person is older than 70 years old. I have to be very, very careful in how I respond, that I'm helping build Jewish life in a place like this. And I'm talking about volunteers who are amazing and they're not Jewish. You know, how do you deal with that?
So I think I remember hearing from one of the Jewish community leaders on one of my first trips, or maybe my first trip, that, you know, who said something to the effect in Warsaw, you know, Hitler tried to exterminate every ounce of Jewish life, every remembrance of Jewish life in Poland, and he almost succeeded, and he destroyed it, you know, to an unbelievable extent, but not totally. And the fact that we're here and that we are able to rebuild, and we, you know, we're not going to rebuild what was, you know, the 1,000+ communities and the life that existed, you know, 100 years ago in Poland. We can never recreate that. But the fact that we're here, that you're there, and Jonathan, Avi, and Rabbi Shudrik in Warsaw and the community there, and other towns, showed that, you know, the resilience of the Jewish people, showed that Hitler didn't totally succeed, that, you know, the Jewish people were the ultimate, you know, we were the victims, but the victors, in terms of that we're here, the Nazis are gone, and we're, you know, maintaining the 1,000 years of plus of Jewish life in Poland, and, you know, preserving. I tell people the importance of preserving the heritage, of teaching people about what existed in Poland before, and also not neglecting, not, you know, in Israel, people talk about, you don't leave a soldier behind, you know, you don't leave anyone behind. So we have Jewish communities that, you know, with people, living Jews, Poland and throughout all the Eastern European countries, you know, how are we to abandon them and just say, you know, we give up on you? Maybe those people, and we know many of them, learn more about their Yiddishkeit, their connection to Judaism. Their families were cut off for a generation, decades. So we're reclaiming Jewish lives. Those people go on to live in other countries, go to Israel. So, you know, how do we turn ourselves away? That's usually what I give, some version of that. I've heard that.
That's good.
You know, the same thing from you, Avi, as you would get many times. I meet people at the airport who would, you know, they come to Poland only to, it really bugs me, to see the cemeteries and visit the Kvarim and the graves. And, you know, and they would ask me, what am I doing? And I'd say, I was doing oh, there's a Jewish community? I didn't even know that. Well, did you go to the synagogue? Yeah, I thought it was just a museum. And they don't even know or care or have any concept that there's a living Jewish community.
Yeah.
So.
Herb, let's thank you for that. Yeah, no, we appreciate that, and I think we're on the same page with that. Let's pivot a little bit and talk about your work today. For 4 years, you've been the CEO of the American Zionist movement. Can you tell us briefly, and I want to get into some issues a little bit concerning the idea of Zionism in the U.S. and college campuses and where we're headed, and it's especially timely as we're of course facing the situation that we're facing with Israel, essentially at war, or in technically at war, but fighting a difficult situation with Hamas. So maybe talk a little bit about what is the American Zionist movement.
So AZM is has been around different names for about 80 years as the umbrella body of Zionist groups in America across the spectrum, Orthodox, Reform, conservative movements, the labor Zionists, Hadassah, the women's groups, and there's now 35 of them. Anyone can learn all about it. I won't go through naming all of them at www.azm.org. We have been the convening body of Zionist groups since the period before the Shoah. So actually, there was always a Zionist movement in America. There were American Jews who went, as it were, from Poland and many countries, to the first Zionist Congress in 1897 in Poland. While it had a huge, Haredi population before the war, had an extensive Zionist community, as is well known before the Shoah. So in America, there was a desire to pull together all the Zionist groups under one umbrella and begin a push for the state of Israel, especially with the UN and other diplomatic bodies being headquartered in New York throughout the later in the 1940s, and when the partition plan. So from the 30s to the 40s, there was the American Emergency Zionist Council, which became the American Zionist Council, changed its name to the American Zionist Federation, and the American Zionist Movement. So we're a movement of now 35 groups, very disparate, from Meretz on the left, groups that are affiliated with Likud, the ZOA, and other groups more on the right, the religious streams of the movements. The Orthodox community is both Mizrahi and now Eretz HaKodesh, which is more in the Haredi area of the community, and Dorshei Torah V'Tzion, which is more in the liberal part of the Orthodox community. So we have the women's groups, we have nonpartisan groups, we have groups that do advocacy, that do social services. We have 9 youth movements and organizations. So we're an umbrella body. We serve as a forum for the Zionist groups to share resources, to discuss common issues. And also we run the American elections for the World Zionist Congress, which is sort of the global parliament of the Jewish people. And through our organizations, we, collectively represent the Americans in both the WZO and in their participation in the Jewish Agency, and the Americans who are in the Karen Kayemet KKL Jewish National Fund. So we've been a body that also promotes Zionism, tries to work with our organizations and in communities to highlight what we believe is the positive nature of Zionism. I grew up, and my father was a you talked about a Zionist household. His mother was a chapter president in the 1920s of Hadassah in Maine. He, went into the Haganah in 47 in Israel after graduating college. So people talked about being in a Zionist household. It was just part of what we were. It's a term that people don't really use. Zionism has become a word, maybe a legacy of the Zionism is racism effort of the UN, that over time, we collectively let our enemies of the state of Israel, the Jewish people, define Zionism, and there's a lot of work to be done to reclaim the term, to
how do we
help educate people.
I want to talk to you about that, because it's become, it was much more straightforward when we were kids, right? You raise money, you put it in the pushka. It was simple. These days, and I wanted to really touch on college campuses, that Israel is demonized in the United States, and it used to be the political, things have completely shifted, and we're seeing that in real time today with the left wing of the Democratic Party. Democratic Party traditionally, you know, a great friend of Israel, and you're seeing you're seeing a huge change. And in some ways, I feel almost like we're you know, plugging holes in, you know, in the dikes, in holes in the dam, right? And it seems that these days, if you were to wear you know, a T-shirt, a pro-Israel T-shirt on the most, if not all, of the top 100 college campuses today in the US, you would probably open yourself up. There's a good chance you would open yourself up to ridicule, or even worse. It seems like the American attitude toward Israel is shifting. And part of that, there are organizations which would consider themselves Zionist, but I would think that wouldn't necessarily meet the criteria for being in the AZM J Street, for example. In other words, the automatic, the given that we grew up with, saying, oh, you're Jewish, you support Israel, you can be critical, but you support Israel. That's not the bed. That's not. It's not a given anymore. So what do we do as an American society? Three of us here are Americans. What do we do about that? Is that fixable?
So obviously there are, and it also, you know, historically, as the American Jewish community have evolved, you know, there are groups that didn't consider themselves Zionist historically, but many of them have embraced that term. There's a long history, obviously, in America of that, but there's many groups that deal now with, you know, with Israel advocacy, or don't even, from our perspective, don't even use the term, you know, Zionist, because it's become a negative term. So instead of being the national liberation movement that Herzl promoted, that continue, you know, many people wonder, why is there even Zionism anymore? You know, wasn't it about founding the state of Israel? So, you know, the World Zionist organizations, the institutions exist, but because Herzl's vision was not just to create the state of Israel, which happened in 48, but to build a state, the Chevra Mofet, to perfect the state, to make it an ideal and exemplary society, and also to connect world Jewry to Israel, which is still a challenge that we have today. You know, I'm not sure people ever anticipated in Basel in 1897 the percentage, or half the world Jews would live in Israel, but there's still a large need to connect world Jewry, the diaspora, with Israel, and that's a you know, a message of Zionism. Zionism should be a positive movement that is viewed in that light by all peoples, and many understand it, but it's become demonized, you know, as unfortunately as a racist term, a colonialist,
even among Jews, you know,
etc. But
Jews.
among misunderstood or not known among Jews, and that's a part of a collective failure, I think, of, you know, of, at least in America, of lack of adequate Jewish education, not only day schools, but in communities, and education on Israel and Zionism, and, you know, whatever there is limited and really too late. When you talk about college campuses, and I have kids who've gone to day school, so they got, you know, a lot of it, and they went to, you know, Zionist camps in B'nai Akiva camp, Mosheva. My oldest son's a lone soldier in the IDF. So, you know, but for many, and I can know from what they hear from others, you know, by the time you educate, you know, work on college campuses, and someone shows up on campus and is bombarded with apartheid week or things like that in their freshman year, when they're first getting settled in, and they don't have the tools and the knowledge and the background, you know, to speak up or fight the battle, it's very difficult. So, you know, obviously we have a struggle, we collectively, with the general population in America, with the issues of intersectionality, and how, you know, there are many groups that have taken up the cause of the Palestinian population, and the Arab population, with and equated it with oppressed peoples, and the whole concept of intersectionality that is permeating on many campuses. Plus, internally within the Jewish community, the need to educate our own people. And obviously, we all, you know, collectively want, you know, the best ultimate peaceful solution that includes dignity and rights for the Arab Palestinian neighbors. That's something enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. But the whole situation has become, you know, complicated, and with the spread of social media and how things get, spread much faster than the past. So we have, really a two-front battle, one with the internally within our community, and one with the larger society.
I'm
These
far more,
issues.
I'm not sure, and I'd like to hear your opinion. I'm far more concerned with Jewish attitudes toward Zionism in Israel than I am about the rest of the world. I want everyone to appreciate the liberation movement ideology of Zionism and to appreciate Israel for what it is, a flawed but generally, I think, a great country that adds a lot to the world. But I can live if the world is a little bit against us. I think, a house divided can't stand, I guess Lincoln, this is my fear, is that the average liberal U.S. Jew, Jew growing up, who comes from a standard background, probably that many of us came from, is not automatically going to be very pro-Israel. And if you extrapolate that 1 or 2 generations down the road, that's going to look at a fundamentally different landscape that we're already seeing. Now, if peace breaks out in the Middle East and things get fixed, maybe that'll change.
And you also have issues.
What do we do?
Right, and those issues are not just about the Palestinian conflict or the territories. And within AZM we have groups that refer to it, the occupied territories, West Bank, and we have groups that say never use those terms. That's Judea and Samaria. So we have everything at our table. And we believe in we believe in a broad tent, but in our tent are groups that are Zionist, and only groups that are Zionist. But the challenges are not only around the house.
Zionist, according to you have certain red lines.
I mean, there's there's the what was Herzl's platform. The Basel platform has evolved to become the Tochnit Yerushalayim, the Jerusalem program, which is the platform, and you can see it on our website, of the World Zionist Organization, and groups have to agree to that, and anyone has to agree to that as an individual member, and basic commitment to the Jewish democratic homeland in Israel, and a number of other categories. And if you don't agree with those basic principles, then you're not considered in the Zionist family. And we have groups. Again, there's a lot of different views, and many of them are represented in the Knesset. We have Meretz USA, which is a party in the Knesset. There's a lot of different people to views them much more on the right. So we have a big range. But what I was going to say is also another issue, obviously, is connection of populations across the religious streams. The connection of people in the Orthodox community, which is not monolithic, is very different than many of the issues that relate to religious observance, to pluralism, to connection that affect connection between those who are in the Reform and Conservative movement to Israel. So complicating everything, with all the debates and dialogue in the public on the Arab, Israeli, and Palestinian conflict are internal issues in the Jewish community, on where on the Kotel and conversions and weddings and all those things. So we're a as Avi can probably give you all the sources, we're a difficult and stubborn and quarrelsome people that goes back, to the citations in the Tanakh. So some of that continues to this day.
I would say we're doing much better than the period of the monarchy. So right. We should at least acknowledge that.
Right.
There was a lot more civil war back then.
Right, but unfortunately, there's still too much today. And the Milchamot HaYudim, the internal struggles within the Jewish community, are something that's worrisome to all of us when we have all these external enemies that are really, as you see today and what's going on in Israel, that they're not discriminating when they're launching missiles from Gaza at this is a secular town, this is a Dati kibbutz, this is an Orthodox area. So Hitler did not discriminate on who they deported to the camps. If you put on tefillin every day or you ate pork on Yom Kippur. So it was there's things that need to bind us together, especially when we have greater challenges and challenges for Israel on the world scene. So I think collectively, there's a greater need for Israel education and Zionist education, beginning as early as possible across the spectrum. However, as different people's ideologies and views of Israel, there's a certain commonality of Zionist principles that are important for our community.
Amen. I think Rabbi Avi and I don't agree about much, but I think we'll both agree with you about that, Herb. But
We agree about most things, or some things.
I came onto the
in the
Zoom
middle.
at the beginning, so I didn't hear the beginning. I'll have to go back and watch it.
I'll quickly say that I was saying that besides the rockets falling, the real, I think one of for me, the difficult aspect is seeing all these, the internal strife going on in Israel. And I said with Jews attacking Arabs and Arabs attacking Jews. And Rabbi Avi felt that that wasn't the case, that it's just Arabs attacking Jews, or if Jews are doing it, it's only as a response. That's what he meant. But I don't want to
I won't get into the middle of that, but I can tell you, I mean, my son who spoke last night as a lone soldier, SAR, to the school in Riverdale where he went.
Where Avi went.
And oh wow, so I'll send you the clip. You know, he talked about one of the lasting impacts of this situation now is going to be the internal issues in Israel. And when I was at JDC, there was a task force on Israeli Arab issues that, you know, working with, you know, to improve the conditions of social services, housing, education among Israel's Arab population. So some of the issues that have come or boiled over or ignited in the last 2 weeks will be part of the legacy that you know, I think everyone acknowledges needs to be addressed and is troublesome.
Where's your son? Where's your son serving?
He serves in the Givati Brigade, a combat infantry unit. His unit's based now in the Lebanon border. So he is, you know, I was in Israel for his tekes when he graduated from basic training, and in November I managed to get in as a lone soldier parent with my family for that occasion, you know, and then we went from there to my father's grave on the Mount of Olives, you know, as my father had been in Machal, and my son's in Machal, the Mitnat Bey Chutz La'aretz, the volunteers from abroad who come, which is a really unique thing in to the extent in Israel of Jewish people from around the world who come to fight, you know, then in 47, even today, to protect the homeland. So I do a different kind of fighting and didn't wear a uniform, but proud to be in the sandwich between two lochamim for the state of Israel, my son and my father.
Kol hakavod, wonderful, Herb. That's great. You're talking to Rabbi Avi, is the father of a Givati officer, and I was a lone soldier as well. So we're on team block.
Thank you. If I can add just one thing, just with AZM, and thank you to Jonathan for hosting, and we hope to be able to travel again. The AZM has hosted delegations of UN ambassadors of foreign countries to the UN. Over 66 countries have participated, with 100 ambassadors from on 4 different trips, where they went at the initiative of then Ambassador Danny Danon and now Ambassador Erdan, together with the AZM president Richard Heidemann, put together and the International March of the Living, put together an initiative to bring foreign diplomats both for a couple of days to Poland to learn about the Shoah and sometimes around the March of the Living, and then go on to Israel to see things firsthand. You know, as the Ein Shmiya Domeh L'Riya, you can't see things, can't understand things without seeing them firsthand in the same way. So you know, it's important for people to see what happened in Poland. Obviously, that the creation of the state of Israel is not just a legacy of the Shoah, but to understand the background and to understand what's going on in Israel on the ground today. So thank you for having the JCC host the ambassadors, and we hope to be resuming that again of course, as COVID eases things, and many things, you know,
we're always
like this Zoom are great, but there are things that can't replace visiting in person.
Of course, no, we're always happy. We love the program. We're always excited to first of all to work in any sense with AZM. We love you guys, and happy, you know, and it's an honor for us to be able to help fly the flag of the Jewish people, and to show not only, especially in a place like Poland, that it's not only death and destruction, there's also a rebirth possible. Herb, are you team Latka or team Hamantash?
Wait, I'm not sure. Is that a question of what's my favorite one?
Yes.
I'm a partisan to Mun Humantaschen.
Oh,
I
very
can
good.
eat a good number of latkes also and sufganiyot, but you know, but
Good
my
for you. I
my
like the
sweet spot
Hamantaschen.
is the Mun Humantaschen.
I like it. I like it. Usually we get latke. And Herb, I always ask people your 3 favorite films.
Hey, I'm not a big film guy, so now you're gonna get me. You know, should I name? I could go for some.
3
My
favorite scenes.
my favorite commentary was Airplane, I guess. I would go with some baseball movies like, you know,
Like Field of Dreams, The
Field of
Natural,
Dreams, I was gonna say,
The
right? And
Natural.
either one of those.
Wait, are you Mets or Yankee fan?
Diehard Mets fan. So
All right.
I bleed blue and orange also.
Ooh, I see. Basically pretty much. Listen, you have the Nachal and the Mets with the AZM logo.
And you know, there's a lot in similarity with the Mets, and you know, waiting for next year and keep hope alive, keeping, you know, our hope alive for you know, so there's a lot of Jewish connections there. You know, in our values as it builds internal fortitude to be a Mets fan. But one of my father's Levaya in 2002, I talked about one of our proudest moments was being, you know, running out of right after Havdalah and Simchas Torah to get to Game 7 of the World Series in '86 and being there in the ballpark when they won. So that was a great that was a great moment. So yes, I am a Zionist Mets fan.
Zionist Mets fan. You heard it here first, ladies and gentlemen. Herb Block, thank you so much. Our good friend.
Thank you.
Herb. Look forward
Thank
to
you for inviting me
and to doing working with you in a lot of different ways. Thank you.
Appreciate it, and hope to see you soon again in Poland.
Hope your son stays safe and well, and thank you for defending Israel.
Thank you very much.
Be well, Herb.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.